area, Kensington and Hamilton, Ontario. Thank you for watching this episode of the News Review.
And for Mondoweiss, Rising Resistance in Jenin and Lawfare in the United States. On January 26th, the Israeli army conducted a deadly invasion of the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. In the span of a few hours, the army shot and killed 9 Palestinians. This is from Mondoweiss. A 10th Palestinian died a few days later from injuries sustained during the raid. It was one of the deadliest single invasions in the Jenin camp and in the West Bank in years. It came on the heels of a year-long effort by the Israeli military to quash the resurgence of Palestinian armed resistance. And the Jenin refugee camp has a long history of armed resistance to Israel's occupation. Yuna, a person featured in a podcast we're about to play, traveled to Jenin days after the deadly raid to speak to the people and hear about what they experienced. And then back to the United States. In 2019, the Jewish National Fund and a group of American Israelis sued the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights over its support for nonviolent BDS movement. The U.S. campaign is a fiscal sponsor of the Boycott National Committee, which has ties to various groups in Palestine. According to the lawsuit, some of these groups are terrorist organizations responsible for firebomb attacks on land owned by the Jewish National Fund in Israel. Activities say this is simply the latest attempt to suppress human rights work. And earlier this month, Diala Shamas, a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights and one of the attorneys representing the U.S. campaign, told The Guardian, the goal is here to harass the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights in places like Jenin and all over Palestine. This is something that we're seeing more broadly, smearing human rights advocates with accusations of terrorism and efforts to drag human rights advocates and protesters into court, into extended litigation that distracts them from their advocacy. And here's a clip from Rising Resistance in Jenin and lawfare in the United States.
Killed, what happened, the damages that were sustained by the civilian population in the camp and the neighbors who live around this home of the wanted fighters that were targeted. But also we were there really to get an understanding of the history of the camp and how that has influenced what we're seeing today, which is a rise and a resurgence of armed resistance groups that we have not seen since the Second Intifada.
And describe for people what it's like in these camps. When you say
Palestinian refugees, now you're talking about the 4th, even 5th generation of refugees have been living in these refugee camps. At the beginning, back in 1948 and the 1950s, these camps were very much what you would typically think of a refugee camp. So tents and sort of these non-permanent structures. But because the Palestinian refugee issue is very much an enduring issue that has lasted for 75 years now, the tents eventually became permanent structures, which eventually became multi-story homes and buildings. And so Palestinian refugee camps are extremely overcrowded. They lack basic and proper infrastructure. The people who live there tend to be amongst the poorest populations within Palestinian society, again, because of the economic losses that they sustained during the Nakba that have continued to perpetuate their families and their communities for generations. And so these are some of the most overcrowded, underfunded, underserviced, and poorest areas in Palestine. So that's not just the Jenin refugee camp, it's Palestinian refugee camps across the occupied Palestinian territory and the diaspora. But that sort of gives you an idea of what these camps look like. So the Jenin refugee camp is around 16,000 people living in an area roughly of around half a square kilometer. And so, like other refugee camps, it's quite overcrowded. A lot of the homes are very close to one another. People are kind of piled on top of each other. And so what happened during the raid is the army targeted one specific home that these fighters were allegedly holed up in, these wanted fighters. And so the main sort of, let's say, the main part of the confrontations and the fiercest part of the confrontations happened around this house. You know, Israeli troops used snipers, guns, rocket launchers, and all sorts of weapons directed at this house and the civilian homes around it. So this house was essentially the house that the fighters were in that belonged to the Sabah family in the Jenin camp was essentially completely destroyed and bombed out. But it also affected all the homes around it. So we visited some of the neighbors and some of the people who lived around that home. Their ceilings and their rooftops were crumbling on top of them because of the sheer force that their homes took in when these rockets and other explosive devices were fired by the Israeli forces towards the Sabah family home. We actually met a woman who you'll be able to see in the video. We interviewed her. The Israeli forces raided her family's home. They ransacked the house. They positioned snipers across the house and on the rooftop. And they actually used this lady's kitchen, her kitchen window, as the launching point for the rocket launchers to fire towards the Bach family home. So her home sustained lots of damage, as did many of the other homes around her.
And there's actually footage from the IDF of them firing the rocket launchers from the woman's kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also include that. So we have this sort of parallel in the video where we show the perspective of this woman and her family and the damage that was done to their home, and also the perspective of the Israeli army and their cameras that they used to also record the raid, which again, they regarded as a very successful quote, anti-terrorism operation.
In the report, you interview on camera a member of an armed resistance group. What was the process like to get that interview? What group did he belong to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the person we interviewed, he was part of a newer armed group in the camp called the Jenin Brigades, or in some translations, it's been translated to the Jenin Battalion. Okay. The Jenin Brigade was formed in 2021 by armed fighters affiliated with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. What the Jenin Brigade has done, and this is very much tied to the nature of the camp that they live in, and the fact that there has always been this sort of cross-factional cooperation within the Jenin refugee camp when it comes to resisting Israeli invasions into their camp, as we saw in the Second Intifada and also most recently. And so while the Jenin Brigade was started by fighters affiliated with the Islamic Jihad movement, they have since sort of developed, or in practice, come to sort of include fighters from across different factions. So Fatah, Hamas, PFLP, other factions in the camp that fight together alongside one another under sort of this branch of the Jenin Brigade. Again, it is primarily affiliated with the Islamic Jihad movement, but it does encompass other factions, and they also do fight alongside the armed wings of other factions in the camp. And so this fighter that we met, he was a young guy. I would place him in his early 20s. and that's sort of the demographic primarily of a lot of these groups. And you're seeing this sort of a younger generation of fighters come up inside this camp and also across Palestine. So we were really lucky to be able to meet with him. So just to give you a little bit of an insight into the process, you asked sort of what it was like to try to get that interview. We had a local fixer with us who essentially in the lead up, as soon as we contacted him the day before, so right after this raid happened, he was sort of working tirelessly to get in touch with these fighters who he has built contact with over the course of many years. And sort of, it was essentially just a waiting game. So communicating with them or finding ways to communicate with them, and sort of this back and forth until we eventually got an answer. And so our fixer was working for, close to 2 days on this. When we were actually there, we spent most of the morning and afternoon filming our interviews and footage with other people in the camp. And then by the evening, we were pretty much just done and waiting to talk to this fighter. And so it was several hours of just waiting. So phone calls back and forth and there was kind of put an effect over his voice, essentially, so to not reveal his identity. So that was also part of the conditions in which we were allowed to interview him.
Yeah. We almost never hear directly from.
While in recent years, we've seen that start to change. Palestinians are starting to get maybe more airtime or more of a platform on in certain media outlets, although there's very much is still an imbalance. But one sector of the population that is still very much not heard from, but is frequently talked about, are these armed fighters. We see images of, in the West, we're constantly inundated with the images of, the quintessential Palestinian terrorist, right?
Mm-hmm.
The masked gunmen. We see their images. We hear Israeli military and security officials and political leaders talking about them. We see political pundits from, all around the world talking about these Palestinians and these Palestinian terror groups and whatnot. But we never actually hear from those fighters themselves. And it's also even within Palestine, Palestinian media and Arabic media, Arabic language media, it's not very common for people to actually interview these fighters. The fighters in Jenin have given some access just over the past year to more media outlets to interview them. So we're not the first, but it is still very rare for people to hear from these fighters. And so clearly these fighters, these armed groups, especially in the past couple months, in the past year, are playing a huge role and an increasingly important role in the current sort of political landscape on the ground in Palestine.
Here's an interview from a Jenin fighter, a clip from an interview of a Jenin fighter that this Mondoweiss reporter is referring to.
شاب زي عز وكمان شباب في جيله عم بيروحوا أكثر
محاصرين جميع النواحي ممنوع نسافر ممنوع نروح ممنوع نيجي.
So she asked, what do you think of,
January 26th,
let's see.
were fighters. 4 of them were in their 20s. Ammar's younger brother, Izzeddin, was one of them.
Why do you think a young man like Izzeddin, a brother, and other young men in his generation are moving towards armed resistance? We are surrounded on all sides, Ammar Salahat said. We can't travel or move about freely. The youth are under pressure. We're under pressure from all sides. Someone's dad is a martyr, or his brother, or his uncle. When they grow up, they want to be like their uncle or their brother. When you turn on the news, it's all about Jenin. People need to do something. Enough of the negotiations. Those negotiations have brought us nothing. Since I was born, I've been hearing about negotiations, and it's all been for nothing. That was a clip. We'll continue with a bit more of the podcast.
Their actions, what they're doing, what they're preaching is part of the conversation. And so we wanted to talk to them and we wanted to hear it directly from them, sort of, you know, who are you? What is motivating you? And, you know, what is your message to people? You know, we wanted to hear it from them. And so one of the first questions that I asked this young man, and he was a young man. One of the questions I asked him was, you know, Israel and the rest of the world says that you are a terrorist and that you belong to a terrorist organization. And that when the army comes in to conduct these raids, they are doing it in the name of counterterrorism operations and quote unquote saving Israeli lives. And so I asked him that. I said, you know, this is sort of how you're portrayed. What do you say to that? What do you think about that? And he acknowledged, of course, that they're aware of the fact that they are portrayed and sort of labeled as terrorists. He said, we know that this is who people think we are. We know people say that we're terrorists. But this label of, you know, violent terrorists who just want to kill Israelis for no reason because they, you know, are maybe anti-Semites and hate Jews. He said, that's not the case. He said, we are not terrorists and we do not even acknowledge that sort of name that's been given to us because it's a name that was given to us by the occupier and by this state and colonial power that has been occupying us for the past 75 years. He said, so I don't even acknowledge that designation. And he said, we are not terrorists. The real terrorists are the Israeli army and the Israeli occupation who are coming into our camps, coming into our streets, coming into our homes on a nightly basis and killing our people. And he said that the world needs to know that we are not the terrorists, Israel is. And when I asked him sort of, what drives you and other young men like you to choosing this path? Because it's a path that most surely will either end in your death or your imprisonment. And he said, you know, we chose this path because of what I saw in my life. He said it was part of my personal convictions. And I made this decision because of everything that I've experienced since I was a child. He said, from the time I was a child, we witnessed.
Yeah, here's the clip she was speaking
which
of.
has been inspired by the groups here inside the Jenin refugee camp.
The world must know that we're not terrorists, he says. As the Zionist occupation claims, we are fighters in the name of Allah. We came out of our mother's wombs to fight this occupier who has stolen. We came out of our mother's wombs.
Now they're part of a growing movement by the groups here in.
Came out of our mother's wombs into this world to fight this occupier who's stolen our religion, our customs, our traditions, who's killed our martyred fathers and our brothers. The world needs to know we aren't terrorists. The occupation is the only terrorist in this world.
Raids, killings, executions, the imprisonment of our families, the destruction of our homes, and all of this oppression that led us to this point.
In the last few days after you finished the filming for this piece, Israeli settlers and military personnel have carried out attacks on Palestinian communities across the West Bank. We've covered this on the site. The Palestinian town Hawara suffered deaths and widespread destruction of homes, vehicles, other personal property. Clearly, the hard-right Netanyahu government is determined to increase the violence being inflicted on Palestinians. What do you and our reporting team there in Palestine see coming in the days ahead?
It's hard to predict exactly how things are going to unfold, of course, but what we can say with certainty is that we are dealing with a right-wing fascist government in Israel. that has control over the lives of millions of Palestinians that for the past 75 years have not had a say in this government or the policies that they put forward to control Palestinian lives and dispossess Palestinians from their land. You currently have some of the most extremist, right-wing, ultra-nationalist settlers who are criminals in their own right and have been accused and charged with terrorism because of their extremely racist and anti-Palestinian beliefs and ideologies. These settlers are now in the highest levels of the Israeli government. They're controlling policy, they control the police and the armed forces. They are the ones that are in control of how land is used in the West Bank. So that means more Palestinians' homes are being demolished, while in turn, settlement expansion is being promoted. And so we're at this point that, this current government is not even trying to hide sort of what their goals are and what they're trying to do on the ground. As you mentioned, sort of what was happening in Hawara over the past couple of days. After what happened in Hawara, you had members of this current Israeli government celebrating the pogroms that happened in Hawara and calling for the complete wiping out of this Palestinian city. And so what we've seen just over the past week and over the past few months is definitely an indication of things to come. I think the situation is going to continue to get worse. Settler violence that is backed and supported and promoted by the state is going to escalate. And at the same time, Palestinian resistance to that in many different forms is going to continue. The person that we interviewed in our Jenin video, there were a couple people that put it very clearly. They said, as long as there is oppression and as long as Palestinian people are deprived of their rights to freedom and dignity, there will always be resistance to that oppression and to that violence. So as long as there is no safety and security for the Palestinian people, there will also be no safety and security for the Israeli people or the people of the world as well. And so I think that we can expect more of what we've been seeing, especially now with Ramadan coming up this month. These sort of tensions and things that we've been seeing in the West Bank are surely to spill over into Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. So I think we have a tumultuous few months ahead of us.
And this is Nori Shabibi, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Nori Shabiba on Jenin.
Yeah, so, Ramallah is the hub of the Palestinian Authority. That's where they all hang out. Their security apparatus is thriving there. U.S. diplomats will come through Ramallah, USA. That's the little bubble that's creating an issue for all of Palestine right now. It's the corruption that's occurring there. That corruption, that economic bubble, in my opinion, has manifested in a sentiment by the public that this is not sustainable, and not only that, it's extremely harmful. And so where you have places like Nablus, which is to the north, and Jenin, which is further north in the West Bank, we saw a mobilization that unified several groups, regardless, if they're of the religious wing or they're leftist. But we see a unification that, one, rejects this corruption and the role that the PA has played in allowing the Israeli army to invade. So the PA, the Palestinian Authority, will notify the Israelis if somebody's in a given location, come get him right here. They'll do that. They share intelligence. The standard of living, the people are really struggling right now. And so when you see this class of people in blacked out SUVs and nice villas and living the life and jet setting. And then you see the child in the refugee camp who's fighting for his dignity. This manifests in a generation of resistance. And I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that our resistance never ended. It might seem as though there were ups and downs, and that might be the case, but through and through, we have always resisted. And now I think things have manifested in a way to where the popular resistance is becoming so widespread that folks are becoming more activated. So in Jenin, I think those calls and those actions of resistance that really confronted not only settlers and their violence around Jenin, but also hit the core of the Zionist entity. That was deeply felt. The Israelis came to their knees, because several fighters went into their homeland. And that, I think, was an awakening for the Zionists to say, we're not secure here ultimately. They're still thinking about coming back to their land. And I think one of the Zionist early thinkers would always say their hope was that the youth would forget, that they'd let go of those lands. The Palestinian Authority in Oslo and that two-state solution was in the hopes people would forget the right of return. But nobody forgot. These youth, these 20-year-olds said, we're not forgetting. We're not going to die just, living on a meager wage and being under the boot of not only the Israeli occupation, but also under the boot of the Palestinian Authority. And they've simply had enough. And so when you have Jenin rise up and you see this beautiful intergenerational collaboration, it's not just youth. There were teachers who would help. One of the recent martyrs was a teacher, and he was trying to help one of those who were shot. And that, there was a doctor who was martyred in Jenin. And you see the different roles within our society, and to some extent different classes. You see women activated. You see this linkage back to the original root and cause of Palestinian liberation, and it's being taken back from the Palestinian Authority. They've maintained a monopoly over what Palestine should look like and what our demands should be and through what avenues. And there's been a concerted effort to denigrate armed resistance, and the people have had enough. When they're getting hit by Israelis and by the Palestinian Authority, they're like, what the heck? There's only so much we can take. And so Nablus becomes organized across different groups and unified. And you see mentorship occurring between older folks who lived through a first intifada or a second intifada, now talking to the youth about principles, about cause, about what it is we're doing, about not settling for the reality of the refugee camp as your ultimate future and end all, but that you have a right to return. And so we have these young leaders rise, and to hear the wisdom in their words. And it's said in such a colloquial way that every Palestinian would understand. It really now puts the Palestinian Authority under pressure, because everything they've been doing has been in complete contradiction to what the people want and what they demand and the means by which they demand.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Or through boycott or whatever. And so with Nablus, it doesn't just end in Nablus. You see a mobilization also in Tulkarm, which is also in the north. You see a mobilization occurring in Al-Khalil in the south. We see a mobilization. We've seen days of violence in Ariha, in Jericho. Shu'afat in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine, became mobilized. Not only that, was adamant about securing their fighters. And so the youth have taken on and resumed, in my opinion, the way I phrase it, the journey of our prior fighters and martyrs. This isn't anything new, but the suppression and the millions of dollars and the guns that were invested into the Israeli military and the Palestinian Authority have effectively failed in muting our youth and the future of the movement.
Oh my gosh. That's inspiring.
Yep, watch this space, and we'll be back with more news.